On this map, the red dotted area represents the region where nearly 90% of Australia's population lives. The vast area you see covering the rest of the country is largely empty. Even today, Australia has an enormous amount of unoccupied land. If all of Australia's land were divided equally among its citizens, each person would receive about 5 acres of land. Australia is one of the world's most developed countries, with modern highways, world-class infrastructure, and a high standard of living. So why does most of its land remain uninhabited? And why is Australia's population relatively small? Here's another surprising fact. Today, when people think of Australia, they often imagine a country filled with white Australians. However, history tells a very different story. The first Australians were not white. So who were the original Australians? What happened to them? And do their descendants still exist today? Hello everyone, I'm Rahul Shupno, and today we'll explore the fascinating history of Australia. So, let's begin. Australia is a country that immediately brings to mind beautiful coastlines, modern cities, and an excellent quality of life. For many people, especially in South Asia, settling in Australia is a lifelong dream. Despite all of its development, millions of square kilometers of land remain almost empty. The reasons behind this lie in Australia's unique geography and its tragic history. Let's begin with Australia's history. We all know how the British ruled and exploited India. But in many ways, the treatment of Australia's Indigenous people was even more devastating. Around 65,000 years ago, during the last ice age, sea levels were much lower than they are today. At that time, groups of people traveled from Southeast Asia and eventually reached the Australian mainland. Before their arrival, no humans are believed to have lived on the Australian continent. Over thousands of years, these early inhabitants spread across the continent. Their traditions eventually became one of the oldest continuous living cultures in the world. Surprisingly, for thousands of years, the outside world knew almost nothing about these Indigenous Australians. That began to change in the early 17th century, when European explorers started encountering Australia's coastline. Reports of this vast southern land gradually spread throughout Europe. Before long, the British also became interested in exploring and claiming the continent. By that time, the British Empire had already established colonies in many parts of the world. They expanded their empire by claiming new territories and exploiting their natural resources. When Britain learned about Australia, it saw another opportunity to expand its influence. In 1770, British explorer Captain James Cook set sail to explore the eastern coast of Australia. He and his crew eventually arrived at Botany Bay, which is now part of modern-day Sydney. When they landed, the Indigenous Australians viewed the newcomers as intruders and confronted them. According to historical accounts, tensions quickly escalated, forcing Cook and his men to withdraw from the area. 18 years later, on January 18, 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip arrived with the First Fleet. The fleet consisted of 11 ships carrying hundreds of people, including British convicts. The British established a settlement on Australia's eastern coast. At first, many Indigenous communities tried to avoid conflict and communicate peacefully with the newcomers. The British claimed they only wanted to build a small colony and promised that the local people would not be harmed. They also promised that the Indigenous people would benefit from British knowledge and technology. A penal colony was essentially a settlement where convicted prisoners were sent to serve their sentences through forced labor. When Arthur Phillip arrived in Australia, many of the people on board were convicts transported from Britain. Among them were people convicted of theft, violent crimes, and other serious offenses. During the following decades, Britain continued transporting convicts to Australia. In less than a century, more than 150,000 convicts had been transported there. As British settlements expanded, Indigenous Australians were increasingly pushed off their ancestral lands. Areas claimed by the British were no longer accessible to many Indigenous communities. Many Indigenous people lost access to the land they had relied on for food, hunting, and daily life for thousands of years. Historical records describe many cases of violence, forced displacement, and exploitation during this period. Many Indigenous Australians were forced to work under harsh conditions without fair treatment. Numerous communities were separated from their traditional lands and way of life. Historians have also documented massacres, sexual violence, and the deaths of many Indigenous men, women, and children during the frontier conflicts. These events had a devastating impact on Indigenous communities across Australia. Today, these injustices are recognized as one of the darkest chapters in Australia's colonial history. At that time, Indigenous Australians had lived in relative isolation from the rest of the world for thousands of years. As a result, they had never been exposed to many infectious diseases that were common in Europe. Meanwhile, diseases such as smallpox, influenza, measles, and other infections had spread widely across Europe. When British settlers and convicts arrived in Australia, some of these diseases were introduced to the continent. Indigenous communities had little or no natural immunity against these unfamiliar diseases. As a result, epidemics spread rapidly and caused devastating losses among Indigenous populations. Historians estimate that disease alone killed a large proportion of Australia's Indigenous population during the early colonial period. There is ongoing historical debate about exactly how some of these diseases spread and whether every outbreak was intentional. However, there is broad agreement that disease, combined with violence and displacement, had catastrophic consequences for Indigenous Australians. As tensions grew, many Indigenous groups began resisting the expansion of British settlements. Throughout the late 18th and 19th centuries, a series of conflicts took place across different parts of Australia. These conflicts are now collectively known as the Australian Frontier Wars. The Indigenous Australians fought to defend their land, their families, and their way of life. However, the British forces possessed far superior weapons, resources, and military organization. The conflicts lasted for many decades and resulted in heavy losses for Indigenous communities. By the late 19th century, the Indigenous population had declined dramatically because of disease, violence, and displacement. At the same time, the number of European settlers continued to grow through migration and colonial expansion. People from Britain made up the largest group of newcomers, but migrants also arrived from other parts of Europe. On January 1, 1901, Australia's separate British colonies were united to form the Commonwealth of Australia. Although Australia became a self-governing nation, it remained closely connected to the British Empire. In the early years after Federation, the government introduced immigration policies that strongly favored people of European descent. These measures became known as the White Australia policy. The policy severely restricted immigration from many non-European countries. The policy remained in place for several decades before it was gradually dismantled after the Second World War. By the 1960s and 1970s, Australia had begun adopting a more inclusive immigration system based on skills rather than race. This change encouraged migrants from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and many other regions to settle in Australia. Modern Australia is now one of the world's most multicultural societies. People from hundreds of cultural backgrounds live together, contributing to the country's economy and identity. This brings us to another important question. If Australia now has millions of people and welcomes skilled immigrants, why does so much of the country remain almost empty? To understand the answer, we need to look at Australia's geography. Most of Australia's largest cities, such as Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide, are located near the coastline. These coastal areas have a mild climate, better access to fresh water, and fertile land for farming. As a result, the majority of Australia's population is concentrated along the eastern, southeastern, and southwestern coasts. In contrast, much of the country's interior is extremely dry. This vast interior region is commonly known as the Outback. Large parts of the Outback consist of deserts, semi-arid plains, and sparsely vegetated landscapes. Rainfall in many of these regions is very low and highly unpredictable. Freshwater sources are limited, making large-scale farming and permanent settlements difficult. Temperatures in the interior can become extremely high during the summer months. Living in such harsh conditions requires significant infrastructure and reliable access to water. This is one of the main reasons why Australia's population is concentrated in a relatively small part of the country. Australia's geography, more than the total amount of land, determines where people can realistically live. Australia's geography presents another major challenge. Along the eastern coast lies the Great Dividing Range, Australia's longest mountain range. Moist air from the Pacific Ocean rises over these mountains, cools, and produces rainfall on the eastern side. This rainfall provides fresh water for cities, rivers, agriculture, and forests. On the western side of the mountains, much less rain falls because of the rain shadow effect. This contributes to the dry deserts and semi-arid landscapes found across much of inland Australia. Australia is also affected by powerful tropical cyclones, especially in its northern coastal regions. These storms can cause severe damage to homes, infrastructure, and local communities. Another important issue is Australia's low birth rate. Like many developed countries, Australia's birth rate has declined in recent decades. As a result, immigration plays an important role in supporting the country's population and workforce. Australia's history is a story of ancient civilizations, colonization, hardship, and transformation. Today, the country is known for its high standard of living and multicultural society, while also continuing to acknowledge and address the injustices experienced by Indigenous Australians. Understanding Australia's past helps us better understand the country we see today. Thank you for watching. See you in the next documentary.